And now, welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Jesse van der Grant. Then let's transition to the specific risks and the potential impacts. I think people are interested in kind of hearing, what are the risks? What are the things that we should actually be worried about? What are the things that get talked about that are not as much of a concern that we can kind of put to bed some of the topics and say, the focus for future research, for future monitoring regulations should really be on these areas. So I don't know if you've got...
I'm biased. I'm already thinking about plumes, but that's because I already worked on plumes and I'm still working in the background on plumes.
Well, good. It's good to be upfront about biases. I think that's something that people in the deep sea mining conversation are hungry for.
Yes. No, there's many different impacts that can happen, right? And some of them are better known than others, like the effects of sedimentation. We know if it's going to be too deep, there will be burial. But the nuances are the more important bit, right? Like how much extra sedimentation is a problem. We don't have as much empirical, actual experimental data for sedimentation, but we do now have some long-term disturbance impact from, like, for example, Disco, which is in the Peruvian basin, and also in the CCZ you had the I'm just going to give the abbreviation. I actually don't know what it stands for. The OMCO, Ocean Minerals something. But these are like these disturbance experiments happened decades ago, and still go back every so often, and you can see the recovery. Again, with the recovery, you hear a lot of different stories about like things are recovering. It's like things are recovering. Things are not the same, but the question is like, would we expect them to be the same? No, I don't think so. But a lot of the recovery studies so far have focused again just on abundances or biomass, maybe on species richness, but they miss that kind of connecting network. Like, how different is the community? Have we gone from, I don't know, a filter feeding dominant system to a scavenger dominant system? Like, those are different functions that we probably should be aware about.
Mm-hmm.
I guess for me mostly, sedimentation, thinking a little bit about...
So hold on, before we move off of sedimentation, let's stay there for a second, because one question here is kind of to what extent is there variation in natural sedimentation and in kind of resilience to sedimentation in the different areas? Because this is something that people argue about, is, we did a sedimentation study, these animals were resilient to however many, I don't know, millimeters of coverage. I'm not actually sure what the right metric is for sedimentation. And then someone else will say, but we're talking now about this other area. No one's done a study there. Can we use this data? Yeah. What do we know about that?
Yeah, it is going to be really area specific, I think, and that's the problem. So, like, for example, in the CCZ, we know that the sedimentation rate is really slow, like really, really slow. Other areas, there will be much higher sedimentation. The sedimentation rate, it's hard to measure, right? It takes a lot of effort to measure how the sedimentation rate. You need to have different kind of floats in the system to kind of see how much new material gets added. And we're talking about such small differences. It can be sometimes really hard to pick it up. And I think also that's good to be aware of, because, if it's that hard to just establish a natural rate, then how are we going to do that with monitoring and say like, a sediment plume added this much more to it compared to natural backgrounds? Because it takes a long time. We don't often have many different points quite close to each other. So when you look at modeling studies that predict sedimentation rate over, for example, the whole globe, you just get these really big areas that say like, in this whole area, this is the sedimentation rate. But it is always possible that there's variation.
And what about temporal variations? So people sometimes say, and then there's benthic storms, which mean that a ton of sediment comes all at once, and that would be similar to a mining event, and so mining is not going to be that far out of the normal range.
Yeah, I personally am not aware of benthic storms in an area like, for example, CCZ. So you would see a lot more sediment transport in, like, for example, slope areas that are on the continental margin, or in canyon systems, or in areas where you have like really strong surface currents, like the Gulf Stream strength. We don't have those kind of strong currents in the CCZ. So I've been trying to, because someone else actually asked a question about this recently as well, but I haven't been able to find anything that kind of shows evidence of it. So be keen to see if other people have this. This is a call out. If people have any information, let me know. So, but then between benthic storms, there's also difference, right? Like a benthic storm, I know if you think about storms, it can be a rain shower storm, or it can be like a thunder tropical storm. So there will be differences in that. And it also comes back to that, like, how often does it happen? What's the magnitude? What's the frequency? What's the duration? I think if benthic storms were very common in the CCZ, we would find more nodules buried. That's my first thought. That's my hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
Happy to be proven wrong. So I don't think benthic storms are at this point a very useful thing to discuss in the CCZ. There might be in other areas, like, for example, seamounts, where we might see, I don't know, like an earthquake that can actually suddenly transport a lot of sediments down the slope of a seamount.
Yeah.
But
Interesting.
yeah.
Again, it's helpful to kind of put this. It's surprising how when someone says, "Yeah, well, just think about what would be the equivalent situation in something that we're familiar with." So then it's like, oh yeah, okay, well, how often does a really extreme like
Thunder.
storm come around wherever you happen to live? And
In some areas more often, in other areas not so much. Yeah. And I think this like idea of like, we really have to be careful, especially nowadays with the debate becoming more and more polarized. We have to think about the context, because it's so easy to kind of find examples from one area that, oh, but here it's not so bad, so it shouldn't be so bad here. And it's like, so for example, I told you earlier that there's been more studies published with experiments conducted to look at the impacts of suspended sediment plumes on deep sea animals. But these are quite often focused on corals or sponges. These are not necessarily representative of the wider ecosystem. And a lot of these animals have come from Norway. In Norway, they collect them in fjords, and fjords are naturally very turbid systems. So their sensitivity thresholds are much higher than I would have expected. But if I look at their background concentrations, I'm actually like, oh yeah, I can see why they are almost as sensitive, like almost as resilient or sensitive, as you like to say, as coastal environments, because they naturally get exposed to a lot of particles being upwelled from currents and tides coming in. But if you go to an area where you don't have those tidal dynamics or wave dynamics, then I think you should still expect something more sensitive. We can see that in shallow water habitats. So why would we not expect that kind of pattern to persist in the deep ocean?
Absolutely. Is there anything to be said about the specific vulnerabilities to sediment? So is it, I mean, I would guess it's like, well, some of these animals are not very mobile. They just get buried. Some of them, they get kind of gunked up by the sediment into whatever filtering apparatus they have. Is there anything else is there heavy metals in the sediment that get suspended and might just outright poison an area? Are there other risks here that I'm not aware of?
So it's going to be, again, very species specific. And I know we don't have those answers. But like, for example, if you think about a sponge will need to pump water through its, I don't know if people know, but if you see a sponge, there's actually a lot of holes in the thing you see. It's a colonial animal, and they can draw in the water by movement of tiny little hairs called cilia. They bring in the water, and from that water they will filter the nutrients, they will take up the oxygen and release the waste and the carbon dioxide. So that pumping is really important for the organism to kind of maintain itself. And if they stop that, they can't breathe. They can hold their breath for a while, but eventually they're going to have to breathe. But they can't clean the inside as well. So if there's a lot of sediment, you will actually see the sponges turning gray and maybe dying. If it's like something like an anemone or even a coral where there's like little tentacles, they can actually pick little sediment particles off. A lot of corals can also produce mucus, so slime that just kind of goes and then hopefully cleans itself. Can be energetically expensive, but hey, it can help if it cleans you up. then, you can survive some sedimentation and maybe better than, for example, sponges. So, and in the deep ocean, we've been studying mainly sponges or corals. But what other organisms do, that's going to be, we don't really know yet. We can look at shallow waters, like specific species that, crustaceans or mollusks, see what they do. But there will always be that question about, is it a good proxy or not? Is it going to be, it's going to be species specific. It's going to be potentially location specific, as in like, are these animals naturally exposed to these kind of things? If there are benthic storms, then maybe they're a bit more resilient than we think. Don't know. You were asking about the metals. I know there's some work coming out. There's a lot of very clever people working on that. And there are different metals that are elevated in both the collector plume, the plume behind the vehicle, and I think also in the discharge plume. But I'm going to say that with a little bit of maybe, because the studies haven't come out in peer review yet. So it's only from presentations and discussions with them directly. But there is, kind of makes sense if you pull for something and you have nodules. Nodules break quite easily. Like if I drop a nodule, it will break. They're fragile. So, if they get sucked up and they hit the wall of the vehicle on the inside and the riser pipes, they're going to shatter. There's going to be parts of it that are going to be really small. When they're too small, they're not going to be taken out in the process. They're not probably interesting anymore for the mining processing facilities, so they'll be going overboard. They are heavier particles, so they will sink quite quickly. But the question is, like, how long are these metals, these polymetallic nodule shards with sediments in water so that metals can leak out? It's like almost like dissolving it a little bit. And then will the sediment particles kind of attach to the metals or not? Like we know that, for example, organic particles can get stuck to sediment particles and that makes them really sticky. A lot of the deep sea sediments in, like, for example, the CCZ, they don't have as much organic material, so they might be less sticky. But again, we need to verify this. We need to test this before we can really say anything. There's a lot of maybes still. It's questions to be answered.
And there's so many. It's interesting, just like, yeah, how many variables appear as soon as we go down any one of these particular rabbit holes to think about sediments, and then suddenly it's not a few different categories of impacts. It's multiple categories on different species from different mechanisms, and everything just explodes. And
it makes it a really wicked problem. I will agree, but it's a good problem. It is a good problem.
Okay. Then if you're happy to move on from sediments, other kind of significant categories of impacts that you think ought to be regulated or managed. I mean, people sometimes put this into kind of just like substrate removal, sediment, noise, and light are the ones that you hear about the most. I don't know if you think those are reasonable categories or how you think about it.
I mean, obviously sediment is there, so that's very, very important. I will admit I'm not familiar with like noise and light. With the noise, I always wonder like, what is noise? Because I feel like quite often with the studies in noise pollution have been so focused on whales and dolphins that they listen, they hear the sound and respond to it. But in a lot of invertebrates, they actually respond more to the vibrations of sound. So that can be really important to like verify, do deep sea organisms respond to the sound levels, or do they respond to the vibrations? Do the vibrations come via the sediment or via the water? It would be really surprised if noise wasn't an issue, because in a dark environment where animals still interact, because the organisms always interact in some way, they signal to each other. If you have a dark environment and light is only goes so far, it would be weird if they didn't use noise. Like in caves, you would see a lot of animals use noise. So it would be kind of, and a lot of the animals that hunt at night, they either have big eyes and they listen to sounds. Like there's just these comparisons where you're like, it would be strange if noise wasn't going to be an issue in the deep ocean, even though we haven't studied it yet. The substrate removal one is, that's their habitat. There are organisms that depend on the nodules. They are attached to the nodules. In some areas, it's the only hard substrate. In other areas where there's, like, for example, close to seamounts, there's other hard substrate from the seamount crust itself. but that sometimes they're similar communities, but sometimes they're not. And then you have these animals that actually live in the nodules. They're very different. Some of them are shared with the sediments, but some of them are not. So it's going to be, again, that nuanced question, like how substrate removal is going to be important for certain animals. Other animal species maybe less so. But
Yeah.
if you are going to mine, then that's a given. You can't even minimize that necessarily, is it? Like, you're going to take those nodules away. There's one, the Impossible Metals is obviously discussing like how many nodules can we leave behind for the animals. But again, we don't know, because we haven't done the studies to see, like, is one nodule enough, or do they need multiple nodules, or is 10 tiny nodules that are not economically interesting, are they equivalent, or should there be also bigger ones, or is there another reason? Is it influenced by how far apart they are or not? All those questions we need to answer before we actually understand if we remove a little bit of substrate, is that important or not?
And the extent that this has been studied is essentially some of these test mining sites where they've mined an area, removed all the nodules, and then gone back however many years later, up to 40 years later, and said, okay, there's some life here. Is that the extent of it, or is there more studies that get into this that have been done?
So the studies that I'm aware of, they're more often, they didn't necessarily remove the nodules. So they did like go through the process of maybe harvesting them, but then also dropping them. They get buried, so they are, out of the system, but maybe not entirely. So it's not as equivalent as like taking them away and definitely having them away. And then it's again the question about like, well, what do you study? So for when thinking about what is still in my mind with all these impact studies is like they look at the big megafauna like suspension feeders that are easy to see on an ROV, or they take box scores from sediments, and those were the sediments. But we just said that stuff on the nodules, in the nodules, can be very different. So that makes it a bit more complicated to know like how important is substrate removal. Like, it's not properly set up, I think, to really understand the effect of substrate removal. It's more looking at disturbance, look at sedimentation, burial, sediment plumes, potential metal release, those kind of things, but not actually the habitat removal. That would be a different kind of experiment.
Fascinating. Okay, light pollution.
I don't know enough about light pollution. I feel like as a scientist, I can't really say anything because I go down with ROV, so I create light pollution.
Oh yeah.
I know that, there's one study that I know of where they show that these hydrothermal vent shrimp had a strong negative impact with their eyesight. So their retina was negatively impacted. But I don't know if there are any other studies that look at the effect of light pollution. The RFV light is very small, it's just a couple of meters, but we do move up and down, of course. Well, we move in one line, hopefully, or we get distracted. We move in some sort of line until we get distracted. And we do know that mobile organisms can be scared away from RFV. That could be of the sound, that could be of the light. I don't know what would happen if you have a more permanent light source in a more restricted area. That I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so then outside of the kind of big four, what are other topics that are worth mentioning? And for me, I guess carbon sequestration or.
Yeah. I mean, definitely the like metal pollution. We still don't really understand how it's being released, how it's going to be taken up, how's it maybe transported in from the map. And then for the carbon sequestration, I will say that's really only a question if for me if it was in the mesopelagic zone, so that 200 to 1,000 meters, just because the diurnal vertical migrators is such a big carbon drawdown. But especially in areas like the abyssal plains, there's not much food getting there to the seafloor. It will get eaten quite a lot. I don't know enough about the carbon cycle in that area, but I don't think it's going to impact carbon sequestration more. I think I would be more interested to discuss, being like, hey, all those ships coming up and down, is that a problem? Like, what kind of release would we have with that? Production of the vehicles, the production, the processing of the nodules with kind of carbon dioxide, that's going to be a much bigger source. Potential impacts on diurnal vertical migrators. I think those are bigger questions for sequestration and carbon pollution than.
Yeah, so this idea that we're going to disturb a bunch of carbon-rich, like setting fire to a peat bog, you feel like that's outside of realistic concern. That what's down there isn't so carbon-rich, and aside from what we pump up, it's going to stay down there.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I am not an expert on this, but there's probably not going to be that much carbon in the sediments. There will potentially be some release depending on what's happening on the ship processing. But I think there are bigger sources of carbon release than those sediments will come just by the ships and by the processing of the nodules. But I don't think the contribution of the sediments. Maybe someone will disagree with me and happy to discuss and learn. But I think
Yeah, I think it's valuable to. I haven't heard anybody knowledgeably say that that's a big concern. I think it's valuable to kind of get it out there when we're talking about the concerning impact.
I think more of what the diurnal vertical migrators will contribute. That is still poorly known. We know in some areas it can be, 30, 40% of the carbon sinking down to deeper waters can be via the diurnal vertical migrators. So that is going to be, I think, a bigger impact because there's still a lot of more food at the surface and stuff being brought down. And then you have the kilometers of water before it actually comes to the seafloor. That part we don't know. We're not discussing as much, but when it's in the sediments, my feeling, my knowledge on it is that it's probably not going to be that much of an impact.
Then, do you have anything to say about the technology? I guess I should also broaden this question to anything before we move off of the actual impacts. How do you think about the different technological solutions, and also how do you think about different regulatory aspects? Like, what do you think are the important places that you see technology being able to mitigate impacts, and where do you see the important places that regulation can make a difference and should be focused?
These are good questions. Definitely not my area of expertise, I will admit.
And that's fine.
But, there's this, as far as I know, and it's going to be very crude to the mining contractors, and apologies for that. But I feel like there are two different types. You have the Hoover type that just sucks up the nodules and sediments, and there's some sediment release at the back of the vehicle, but also a lot of it gets sucked up. And then you get a lot of unwanted stuff that needs to be discharged. And then you have the more like the AI, the robots from Impossible Metals that kind of aims to pick things up. And if you pick things up and the robot hovers above the seafloor, yes, you're gonna avoid large sediment plumes. You're gonna avoid those vibrations in the sediment, but you still have the habitat removal. You will still have light pollution because the robot needs to see something, I believe, unless they're doing it with sound, but you have sound pollution. So I mean, I do know that, over the last couple of years, engineers have been listening to some of the concerns of the biologists, and there's been different designs about how they can release more sediment at the seafloor with the mining vehicles. There's also been discussions about how they can encourage the sediments to flocculate more before they actually get released. And that flocculation is really important because then you get larger particles, and larger particles will sink quicker. And smaller particles are much harder for animals to reject, or it gets stuck in their gills or other sensitive tissues. So those kind of discussions and potential solutions, those are really interesting. But I haven't been reading the literature on their latest design, so I don't actually know the state of it. I know that they had the intention of making those designs, but I don't actually know where they're with that right now. Yeah.
What about the regulation? Is there anything to say on that? When you follow the development of the mining regulations, are there some that you really think, okay, this is an important area that needs to be stressed?
I mean, so we have been discussing at the International Seabed Authority, we've been discussing the regulations for a while now. I think some people think too long, but at the same time, I think because we're dealing with so many different stakeholders and objectives, it's okay not to rush these things, right? Because I don't know, when I joined probably like 5 years ago, and I had discussions with delegates about this is a deep sea environment, this is a deep sea animal. Like that basic knowledge wasn't
Yeah.
present. And now, actually, when I go to the ISA, even new delegates, they will know what they're talking about. So there was definitely that mismatch that didn't help the discussions when I joined, but now people seem much more knowledgeable about what they're actually trying to regulate. So that is really helpful that they have this basic knowledge. And I also think, like the regulators are not just thinking about the biology and conservation, but they're also thinking about liability. They're also thinking about where ownership is and how do we share the benefits, because especially the ISA is concerned, these minerals are the common heritage of humankind, right? So these nodules, these crusts, these polymetallic sulfides, these hydrothermal vents in international waters are from everyone currently living and in the future. So saying to one person, it's like, hey, you can mine that. You can't just do that because it's all our ownership. So there needs to be benefit derived from it, which is always a difficult thing, I think, for a company to hear. Be like, hey, some of your money will need to go, and they obviously want to make more money because it's a business. But then the countries, they're like right now, what they're like 169 countries that are a member of the ISA plus the EU. They'll see a number divided by the number of countries plus a few adjustments for the fact that there might be developing states, there might be states with land mining interests that need to be compensated. So, if it's only like a couple of $10,000, that's not really a good trade-off for them as well. So there's this kind of other side that doesn't often get included in debate, I think. And the ISA could actually talk a little bit more about the fact that it is common heritage. The benefits need to be shared. So there needs to be a benefit for all countries to kind of start agreeing on these regulations. A lot of countries are seeing certain types of risks, like, for example, to the tuna fisheries, that need to be understood properly so we can make those trade-offs. Meaning, like, if I get, I don't know, if my country would get a couple of millions from deep sea mining, but they lose much more because of impacts on tunas, then that is not a good decision for them. So they need to know, like, where are the costs, where are the benefits? Is it indeed going to be beneficial in the total sum, not just in the mining gains, if you know what I mean?
Right.
That's I think those discussions make it really complicated. But then that also means that something like the ISA, where you get all these different interests coming together and where they have to build consensus, is actually super important and super valuable. And I think some people also forget, when you build consensus, it's probably good if no one is happy. But if one party is happy and the other isn't, you've done something wrong. So it's all about giving and taking something and recognizing each other's needs, recognizing trust. Because, we are asking a lot of trust from each other, being like, hey, you're promising this, I'm promising that. How is that going to work? Am I as a scientist feel like being listened to, that some of the concerns I've raised, some of the large uncertainties that I see that can carry potential high risk, is that being properly addressed or not? So I think something like the ISA is fantastic. I'm well impressed with the Legal and Technical Commission. They do a lot of work. I think a lot of people don't realize that they do a lot of unpaid work. And I think that's also an aspect that we often forget. Like, the ISA is an independent organization, independent from the United Nations. It's already getting late, isn't it?
Yeah.
From the United Nations, and they don't have a big budget, considering that they have to, manage more than 50% of our planet's surface. They have a very frighteningly small budget, and they rely on a lot of expertise, and a lot of that expertise comes free and do a lot of work. And they have all of these like different timelines and sometimes unclear instructions. And I think they try to do the best they can. I feel like lately, when the council is also getting a little bit better in requesting what is needed, it's getting to a better place. But it's a huge task, and it's gonna take a lot of listening to each other, listening to concerns, discussing the concerns, but discussing it also from like a like an open mind, because I feel like the last couple of years things have polarized so much that people are just not listening to each other anymore, which doesn't help the debate either. Like, it's just like, oh, you say this, so I'm already against it. Like, that's not helpful. That's not helpful.
Well, I mean, that's it's nice to hear an optimistic message about the ISA. I feel like, especially since the last meeting, I have heard a lot of people sort of questioning its functionality and
I can
things. So
understand
it's
why they're saying that. I was there. I also felt like there was definitely this atmosphere where, um, I think people are tired. That for one. Like, we've since the triggering of the 2 year rule in 2021 during COVID, the number of meetings have increased. The length of the meetings have increased. There's been much more intercessional work, and there was a real, like, effort, I think, from a lot of states, like, where they come together in small groups and really propose text and really engage with these different, like, opinions and try to build that consensus. And it was going well, but now obviously with the uncertainty that has come from some of the statements made by the US administration, I think that probably played a role, being like, we've been trying so hard to build consensus, to promote multilateralism. Yes, we recognize that debate has been polarized a little bit, but this is like, as if someone joins a race at the last moment and just didn't run the last, I don't know, 10 kilometers in just the last 100 meters. I can feel that was how I felt, as it were. But I still believe that this multilateral process is the best way, given that we're dealing with common heritage of humankind, and given that it's going to require a lot of trust, because these companies will be operating days out from the coast. They will be in
yeah,
international waters where there's different regulations. No one can, like, sail towards them and be like, hey, how are you doing? No one can check what is happening underwater. There's going to be a lot of trust that the data that they supply and the monitoring data that they supply is indeed trustworthy. So, and I think that gets forgotten, that we need to build those trust relationships with each other, between different countries, between different companies, between different NGOs, different stakeholders. And the way that it's going potentially now, that breaks down a lot of that trust.
I'm always interested how often trust comes up in this conversation about deep sea mining. And to me, I think it's a very important and kind of difficult commodity to
Mm.
inject into the conversation. And like you said, it's becoming more polarized. And so I wonder if you see trust being harder to achieve now than when you kind of got into this game.
I think it really depends on who I'm talking to. So if I'm talking to, like, country delegates, then it's still possible to build those trust relationships. I mean, there's sometimes some geopolitical stuff in the background, but sometimes there's other scientists on the delegation, and, like, as scientists, we should just be able to discuss things at a space that, like the ISA, right? Because that should be a neutral space where all these countries can come together and discuss these regulations, and ideas that are being proposed. I think for other groups, it is becoming a little bit harder, and trying to understand, like, some of their objectives and needs. And, like, for I can understand that a mining company, which has already spent a lot of money and, started, in their eyes, started with this process when they got their exploration license. But at the same time, if I can be, like, devil's advocate, it is a little bit weird that you started to play a game without knowing the rules, right? Because the exploration regulations took a long time to make. They've been finished, but there was no economic incentive with that yet, right? Now we're dealing with the exploitation regulations, where there's a lot of different economic objectives in there, and they want to get that done as quickly as possible. And even a lot of delegates want to make that as quick as possible, with following both objectives, like not just managing the mineral resources, but also conserving and protecting the marine environment. That is UNCLOS, that's the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, that is in there, Article 145. So they have to follow that. And then at the same time, like, it's like the High Seas Agreement that was just finished. That took how long? 10 years? There was economic objectives in that, but not to the extent as in this one. So you can almost, I don't know, I almost feel like if I look at these different big multilateral discussions and agreements, depending on how much money you could make with it, extended some of that duration of the discussions, right?
Yeah.
And as some of the complications have also come in that we now know more now than we did when we started. So, before we thought that the whole abyssal plains were the same, and now we find out there's actually different things. And we realized that a lot of the areas of particular environmental interest, these big areas that needed to protect and conserve biodiversity in the CZZ, didn't actually host the same type of communities, and that there were different species in that, so they weren't doing their roles. And that can happen when you, I don't know, I feel like start drawing the rules and start drawing boxes before you actually have any data. It just underlines again how important it is to know your system, understand your variation before you
Yeah.
manage it.
So a little bit of a reality check around the expectations that some of the actors had in like this next stage should just have been done by now. You feel like there should be some recognition that this was always going to be a difficult process, that it was never assured to happen at a quick
Yeah.
pace. And so,
And I
yeah,
think, like, especially given the increase in number of meetings and the length, and we're still not done. I mean, if you just see how much extra work we've been putting in the last 4 years compared to the years before that, it's been immense. And we are close. We are getting closer. Every meeting, we're getting closer. Every meeting, there's more consensus built in the regulations. But yeah, there are still some really big issues, including like the benefit sharing
the
regime.
benefit sharing.
That's a real difficult one. I'm not an expert. Please do not ask me any questions on it. But that's a really difficult one, and it's easy to see why. But then also, coming back to that trust discussion, the inspection and enforcement, and they're trying to think about how can we manage and monitor that all the rules and regulations are being followed. That is now also a big topic of debate, the ICE debate. Yeah, inspection, compliance, and enforcement. That comes down to trust as well. You need to be able to trust what they're reporting, but also at the same time, you need to be able to do spot checks. And then we need to know that the person that is doing the spot checks is also trustworthy. It can't just
Okay.
be another company person. So I think like these are really complicated questions that come from all these different users and all of these different objectives that people have, that different countries have, that different industries have. And that it sometimes gets a bit lost in the debate, I think, which is why it doesn't help to get this polarized debate, because then you just have this really narrow tunnel vision, and you can't actually discuss being like, hey, what's your issue? Oh, you're worried about fisheries. Well, let me tell you, we're going to put the plumes deeper, and if you don't trust us, let's get it in the regulations. Then it's definitely a thing that we need to follow. Like simple things like that. I mean, I'm a scientist. Maybe I'm too simple about it, but
I appreciate that. So, okay, well, I see we're already significantly over time.
that's okay.
I guess I'll just, this is a pretty good segue to my somewhat awkward trade-off question, which I ask everybody because it relates to my research and it's what I'm trying to wrap my head around is how does anybody make a decision that involves balancing between benefits and drawbacks, especially ones that aren't in kind of comparable categories? If that question makes sense, and if you've thought about it, I'm interested in whatever you have to say.
I think if we had a straightforward answer to that question, we would be in big business, because that question is not just for this debate, right? It's not just deep sea mining. Any kind of area that's being managed where you have natural resources and like important biological areas will have impacts, will have friction, will have unhappy people. Like I see it in the Wadden Sea as well. So it's not an area specific question. And I think if we If we knew how to balance it, that would be it, right? Then it would be management gold. That said, like understanding the potential trade-offs, understanding the risks, and there's a lot of different regimes out there that can be applied more or less successfully about what is a good thing. Understanding who carries the risks, who pays for the risks, understanding accountability. I think those kind of questions, if we have good answers for that and answers that everyone can stand behind, then we will get very far. But right now, it doesn't always seem like we are really addressing all the different trade offs. So we're focusing a lot of monetary gain and less so on other things. And that's also because we don't know the other things as well. Like the ISA has published a study, a report a couple of years ago themselves that stated we don't know enough about ecosystem services provided by the deep ocean to value them. We just don't really have the numbers. So then, those are data gaps that need to be addressed. The LTC last July kind of rightly said, like, we're working on environmental thresholds, but lo and behold, there's very little data. So this is going to be really challenging. We need to do something about that. I think for me as a scientist, there's a very straightforward answer. You need to fund science so that we can do the necessary work, do the experiments, measure the thresholds, measure the ecosystem valuations. It's hard to get funding for those kind of experiments or studies anyway. But hearing that the need for it is like, it's sometimes a bit frustrating then as well, being like, there are certain ways forward, but we're not really going that way. And then I think talking to each other, understanding the concerns of each other, understanding a little bit of the humanity behind each other. It's like, why are you afraid of this? What does this mean to you? What does it mean to me? If something went ahead or not, what does it mean for each other? Like those discussions we don't really have. I'm also not the right person to have them because that's more a social scientist job. Field of play, but I do feel like we significantly lack the social scientist perspective in this debate. I mean, you and I already had the pleasure of discussing this once before, but yeah, everything is just trying to become a hard cold number, and I feel like that misses an aspect of management. It makes it maybe simpler, but it doesn't always lead to right solutions. So yeah. We need to have
that's that's a valuable answer to my nebulous question. It is kind of both fill in the information on the different categories that we can, to the extent that we're talking about trade-offs across a bunch of different categories. It never hurts to just kind of pump our knowledge about the independent categories full, and then secondly, to kind of cross-pollinate the human aspect, and especially I think the concerns. This is something that a few other people have raised, is that there seems to be, on the one hand, trust is a big word, and then on the other hand, fear is a big word for, I think, why polarization and why so many emotions come in here. And so to
I don't
clear
know.
out.
Yeah, I don't know if I would call it fear. Fear almost, I don't know, has such a negative connotation. But concern, I think concern is an okay emotion to have, being like, I'm concerned about my livelihood, or I'm concerned about this. And, we're all sharing this planet together, and we're all dependent on the ocean in some way. So yeah, if someone is going to mess with that, it'd be maybe nice to know if that's going to impact me or not.
Okay, well, Jesse, thanks so much for taking so much time and explaining this to the listeners of this podcast. So, is there anything else that we haven't touched on that you would like to mention before we
talked about so many things, didn't we?
I feel like we've covered a lot. I think this is going to get split into 2 episodes.
Well, in that case, we can continue. Nothing comes to mind. I feel like we have covered a lot of things. There's always scope to go into more detail for certain things.
Then great. So where can people follow you if they want to hear more of your thoughts on the topic, but also where else would you point people who are interested in educating themselves more specifically on the ecological impacts? Is there some good data sources out there that you would
Yeah. So first on like where to follow me. I'm very sorry. I'm really shit to follow. I do have a few social media things, but I don't ever check them. So I don't update them. It's very poor, I know. So I don't know. I think the best way almost is actually looking up Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
That's more tailored towards policymakers, but because policymakers have such big variety in backgrounds, we do try to make our language more accessible. There's also, DOSI has been releasing a few podcasts to go into certain areas that we're focusing on and explaining a little bit more behind them. There's a few other things DOSI has. There's a children's book, I think, that is freely available on the DOSI website, but don't ask me where.
Nice.
Probably. So, and there's like, DOSI is a whole network of experts, right? So I've said a few times, oh, I don't know. But there will be someone out there that knows. And there's a good chance that that scientist is a DOSI member. So it can help pose questions to DOSI because we can put you in touch with people that probably know best from a scientific perspective.
That's a good link. So I'll put links. Maybe I'll get you to help me find the right links to put in the show notes if anybody wants to get in touch with DOSI, ask us an expert a question. I am going to be asking for a children's book to read to my kids.
Yeah.
So, and yeah, I can forgive you for not being active on social media. I think it sounds like you've got enough going on.
It's too much. Like, I do read other people's posts, but I don't really engage. I feel like, I don't know, I'm a tiny fish. I'll just get lost in the ocean. So I'll see what people are concerned about and then focus on my papers and other stuff.
Well, then, again, thank you so much for coming on.
Having me. It was a real pleasure.
And I hope that we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, that would be lovely. I'll follow you. I'll keep following you. And then see where this discussion takes you.